Hello, thank you for joining me for today's podcast. On today's podcast, I'm calling it Why I Include the Unpleasant Details in My Work. This idea came about a few years ago when my good friend, the late great Jack Olson, and I used to talk on the phone and in person and discuss what Jack liked to call the embellishing and embroidering of information and facts within nonfiction and true crime in particular. Something that we both hated, something we shared in common, that we always were disgusted by other authors doing this, but nothing that we have any control over, of course, except in our own work. So today I'm going to focus on that subject. Anyone who has read my work before knows that I always include the unpleasant details of the cases that I write about, whether those unpleasant details be the depraved sexual practices of the offenders in a given case, the gutter street language that many of these people use, or the often graphic descriptions of how the crimes were actually committed. I do not do this to offend or to be gratuitous or to be disrespectful to anyone, nor do I include such details to strip away the dignity of the dead. I do this because we live in a real world, not in some fantasy land of a writer's imagination. In the real world, where horrible and despicable things happen to real people on a daily basis, we owe it to our readers to show the truth. I do this because I consider myself a purist of sorts in a genre where the criminals, unfortunately, are often nowadays being portrayed less viciously than they actually are. A questionable practice being employed ever increasingly by certain writers who worry more about being trendy than in just telling the story like it actually happened. These writers, of whom I am admittedly being critical, for reasons that I'll get into shortly, tend to show the criminal as being less diabolic, immoral, or evil, all in spite of what the criminal has done. Fortunately, a majority of the people who read true crime still want to know the truth about what happened in a given case, not some made-up, fabricated version that came to seed in some writer's imagination. Most readers also want to learn what happened through the simple and age-old technique called storytelling, and can do without the bulkiness of pretty prose, filler, and the writer's opinionated supposition of what might have happened. Educated guesses, in other words, because he or she didn't take the time to adequately do his or her research. I should note right here, before I've gone too far, that if I have failed on any of these counts in my own work, my failure is solely my own doing. In spite of my candor about all this, I have, on occasion, been accused and denounced, if you will, as having been offensive, gratuitous, and disrespectful in my writings by members of the print media, mostly by journalists and columnists, but even though less so, by fellow writers. Many of the same people who are always the first in line to get the most sordid details of the most sensational murder cases, and always only for a shallow headline story that fails to provide any insight into the mind of the criminal or why the crime was committed in the first place. To me, it seems kind of strange and unethical to be castigated by the very people who claim to do the same thing that I and other fine crime writers do for a living. That is, to report the truth behind a particular criminal investigation. So why all the double standards? Are double standards necessary for a crime writer to succeed and gain the respect of his colleagues in this business? For a long time, I certainly thought so. But I kept quiet about this sensitive subject, out of fear and further retribution by those whom I used to respect. Now, however, I no longer care about the approval and acceptance I had sought from these people, since it is not they who make my living. In all likelihood, I wouldn't be able to change their biased, shallow minds anyway, no matter how hard I tried. So instead, I offer these words as a means to enlighten the general reading public to what really goes on behind the scenes, and out of my hope that more purists in the genre will come forward with their views, many of whose views I know to be similar in nature to my own. Although it is not my intention to sermonize here, I do want to make a few points which I feel are significant to not only the cases that I've written about, but to the genre of true crime itself. Yet another purpose of my remarks is to clarify, perhaps even counter, a few inappropriately placed statements written and stated over the years by others within the genre about what is proper or suitable material to include in a true crime book. I do this, I suppose, as a type of defense of my style of reporting or writing, and to allow you, the readers, to see for yourselves why I include material that is deemed objectionable by other writers. Then, of course, you can make up your own minds as to whether my decision to include such material is appropriate or not, and decide whether you will want to read any of my other books, past or future. First of all, it is important to me for you to know that my years of researching and writing about true crime cases has not made me callous or unfeeling toward the families of victims of violent crime. If anything, writing about such cases for so long has had the opposite effect. Although there are some in this business who have tried, unsuccessfully I might add, to paint a much different picture of me, I have always felt somewhere in the back of my heart that the families and loved ones of victims of violent crime are, without question, victims too. My past experiences and observations have led me to believe that, in many ways, those left behind to deal with the aftermath of, for example, a violent murder are quite often left more victimized, at least in the emotional and psychological sense of the word, than the victims themselves. How can this be? The answer, when you think about it, is really very simple. When a person has been murdered, robbed of the rest of his or her life by the actions of another, there is no question that the person has become a victim of the ultimate crime, an unwilling participant in human tragedy taken to the extreme, often through no fault of his or her own. But as horrible and as loathsome as murder is, it is but a one-time event for the unfortunate victim. After their life light has faded away, it is all over for them. Gone is the terror, pain, torture, and fear of the unknown to which they had been subjected by the assailant. Born from nothingness, they are returned, albeit prematurely, to the nothingness from whence they came. Depending, of course, upon one's philosophical and religious beliefs surrounding the drama of existence, life as we know it is all over for the murder victim. But what about their loved ones? The murder victim's survivors are left behind to recall, again and again, the unpleasant details of the pain and the agony suffered by the victim. Try as they might to get over the tragedy and to get on with their lives, the pain and the anguish never goes away. Instead, their pain and heartache is brought to the forefront every time they pick up a newspaper and read about yet another murder, when they see and hear the same bleak details every time they turn on a television or listen to a radio, every time they look through a photo album of memories of happier times, or merely when they agree to speak to a writer such as myself. Although they are grateful when the killer has been finally apprehended, they are nonetheless again reminded at that time of their loss and must, again, recount the sordid details of what happened. And that's really just the beginning of it all. It is, of course, even worse, if such a thing is possible, for the families of victims whose bodies are never found and whose killers are never brought to justice. Those unfortunate souls can never fully go forward with their lives because of the near constant painful thoughts and feelings, emotions that sometimes turn into an obsession of not knowing what really happened to their daughter or son, husband or wife, sister or brother, mother or father. In the backs of their minds, they know that their loved one is in all likelihood dead, but they keep hanging on to the slender, cruel, and painful threads of hope, a hope that is rarely ever realized or answered. Those families of victims of violent crime whose cases are solved, however, are forced to relive the ordeal again when the killer is arraigned, again if and when the case goes to trial, and it's even harder on them if it doesn't go to trial, again during the sentencing and the lengthy appeals process, again at the parole hearings that will eventually occur in many cases, and most certainly when books like mine are published. The pain, in short, renewed by all of the reminders, simply does not go away. Which now brings me to the whole point of this discourse, which I will address by attempting to answer the following question. Do some true crime writers go too far in their reconstructions of what really happened in a murder case? Personally, I don't think so, although there are writers, as well as a few readers, who would disagree. I have always believed that true crime writing should be as accurate and as honest as possible. If this is accomplished by the writer, books such as mine can and often do, even though they first renew the pain one more time, they can serve as a closure of sorts for the family of a crime victim. To succeed in this manner, true crime books should unerringly reflect not only the enormity of the crimes themselves, but the aftermath and the terrible consequences which the victim's survivors always have to endure. There should be little room for error, careless misstatement of the facts, excessive supposition on the part of the writer, or a profusion of so-called literary license taken in true crime books and other works of nonfiction. Dramatic but honest recreations of the events are acceptable, often necessary, and sometimes even desirous to keep the pace of the story moving forward, to keep the reader turning the pages, and to create the greatest impact as to the severity of the crimes that were committed, and to enable the reader to feel the victim's pain, anguish, and suffering, and to feel the terrible aftermath that the survivors endure. But all too often, books and stories in this genre fall far short of the mark and are rife with all too many of the infractions I have been talking about, transgressions which are quite surprisingly frequently committed by even some of the best-selling authors who should know better. A few true crime writers, and I don't intend to mention their names, will also go out of their way to justify why they're even writing within the genre. Some go far as to appear apologetic for what they are doing for a living and never, even for a moment, admit that they do it for the money, that is, the commercial success that true crime writing often brings. Which calls to mind another point that ties in with the first, that of integrity and how far some writers will go to achieve commercial success, which I will delve into momentarily. What am I driving at, you ask? Do I think that there is anything wrong with being a true crime writer? My answer, as you likely anticipated, is an emphatic no, as long as the writer has maintained a high level of credibility and does not write something for which he or she could be discredited. Do I write true crime for the money? Yes, indeed. I am not ashamed to admit it, nor will I mislead you into believing that I do it for the sake of the victims and their families. It's what I do for a living, and that is exactly what I tell the families of crime victims. But does that make me a trollop? No, it doesn't. Not any more so than it makes the police officers, paramedics, doctors, psychologists, lawyers, and the so-called news media people who make their living dealing with such matters. Logic dictates that if I am a whore, then they must be too. I also tell anyone who will listen that in addition to earning a living at this, it is also the crimes, the manner in which they are committed that interests me. It is the fascination with the criminal mind that makes certain types of people tick, do what they do, in other words, that keeps me going. It is also the aftermath of the crime and how it has affected people's lives that stirs my emotions, keeps me alive. Truth is very much stranger than fiction, and that is why I keep writing it. It is in the worst instances of this unnecessary, false justification for writing true crime that some writers exhibit, a type of writer's guilt, if you will, that I've been going on about, that is most easily picked up by the reader. But there is no need for a writer to carry on with this so-called guilt, and the apologizing that always seems to go along with it. Why not just be honest about it and call it what it is, like I've been doing here? After all, readers of true crime are by and large an intelligent group, and the readers I've met certainly seem to be above average in their sensitivity toward others. Most don't read true crime because they are voyeuristic, love violence, or want to gloat over the unfortunate things that happen to other people. Indeed, most people who read true crime do so because they abhor violence, and they want to see the criminals brought to justice. For others, reading true crime serves as a sort of escapism in which the reader gets to be an armchair detective of sorts, gets to play a part, at least in their minds, on the stage of justice, and live momentarily in the world of catching the bad guys. Writers who resort to this pretentious justification for what they write, and those who do so even when they appear on television talk shows, often are attempting to deny, or at the very least, to overshadow their literary roots, their beginnings with, for example, the pulp crime magazines of yesteryear, a handful of which thrived until about 1995. But why even do that? Why be ashamed of where one started? The late Albert P. Govani, who for years served as editor-in-chief of True Detective magazine, perhaps summed it up best when he said, and I quote, "Raymond Chandler once pointed out, there is more drama built into one of our stories than any writer could hope to inject into a piece of fiction, simply because the bodies and blood are real bodies and blood, the detectives are real officers, and the detective work that goes into the solution of some of our cases is often so brilliantly incredible that no fiction writer would dare try to make his readers believe his fictional hero could pull off such a feat." End quote. Moreover, it is interesting to note that some of the great writers and influential minds of this past century actually started out on the pages of detective magazines. People such as Admiral Richard E. Byrd, Walter Winchell, the actor Clark Gable, J. Edgar Hoover, Stanley Walker, and famed attorney Marvin Belli. President Franklin D. Roosevelt subscribed to True Detective until his death. Albert Einstein was another subscriber, and so was five-star General Mark Clark. The fictional character of Sam Spade might never have seen the light of day had the words of his creator, Dashiell Hammett, not graced the pages of True Detective first. So why all the shame over meager beginnings? It seems to me that some of these pretentious few are trying very hard at times to give the rest of us a bad name for reasons that I can't wholly grasp, perhaps attempting to elevate their own literary stature by putting the rest of us down. Perhaps they have delusions of cornering the true crime market. Who knows? The long and the short of it, however, is that there is no reason to justify or apologize for being a true crime writer, as long as the writer has maintained his or her integrity by writing accurately and honestly and has not attempted to deceive his or her readers. It follows, and this is an equally important point that I have carefully considered, that some of these guilt-ridden writers will nearly always attempt to sugarcoat the facts of a given case under the guise of sparing the survivor's feelings, and will look the other way when it comes time to present the unpleasant details. Some of these writers will say that it is more important to explore the why behind a crime rather than the how, but at the same time they will deceptively leave out the fact that the what happened or the how behind the crime almost always sheds considerable light on and leads investigators directly to why the crime happened in the first place. The why, which is elusive in more cases than it is not, and the how, and this cannot be overemphasized, very clearly go hand in hand. In those instances when the why can even be figured out, it and the how should be treated with equal importance by the true crime writer, just as they are considered by the investigators who solve these crimes. It is difficult, if not impossible, for the writer to have the presence of the why without the presence of the how and still maintain that high level of credibility that I have been belaboring here. In most homicide cases, at least in the ones that I have studied, and I have researched hundreds, the why can't be discovered without a careful study of the how. In reality, those writers who claim that they leave out the unpleasant details out of sympathy for the families of the victims do so more for their own self-serving wants or desires than for any other reason. They do it for the thing called marketability, the packaging of the work into other media formats, such as a television movie of the week. The television networks, of course, maintain far stricter guidelines on the depiction of violence than do books and magazines. And if writers depict in their books all of the violence that occurs in a given case, they quickly find that it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, to make that much sought-after network television sale. And here is where the gray area of that thing called integrity creeps in. Should an author's desire to have his or her book made into a movie be allowed to overshadow what it is that he or she is writing about? Regardless of how far some writers will go to make the reading public believe otherwise, they don't overlook the unpleasant details to spare a victim's family. The family of a crime victim already knows the gruesome details and has relived them time and time again, both inside and outside the courtroom, and will carry the vivid details of what happened to their loved ones to their graves. So who's kidding whom? It has been my experience and personal observation over the years that the families of crime victims want the details to be told just as they occurred. This is especially true of several of the families that I've talked to. Most families of crime victims don't want the sugar-coated version of what happened appearing in books and movies because it does not show the killer in an accurate light. I don't depict serial killers, for instance, being handsome or good-looking, even though they might be on the outside. Inside, they're ugly and they're monstrous, and this is what I show the readers, and I do it consistently, and I wouldn't dream of doing it otherwise. Sugarcoating a case under the guise of sparing the victim's family is a blatant falsehood that goes back to a writer's greed and desire to broaden their readership. What I've described as a conspicuous and sometimes aggressive attempt to move their work farther into the more lucrative mainstream literature and to other media formats. Such writers often leave out pertinent details so they can satisfy their producers and the network executives in charge of a format where the depiction of violence is becoming more and more taboo, and the First Amendment guarantees of free speech is taking a backseat to ambivalent social values, being determined by dangerous and scary government intervention, a creeping, growing return to the McCarthyism tactics of the 1950s. But that's another issue. Or is it? Nevertheless, to stay on track here, this deceptive sugarcoating by the true crime writer is to further his or her own goals, should be recognized as such and nothing more. Presenting a case as it occurred is not necessarily bad writing, as some of these writers would have you believe, and does not negatively reflect a writer's research and literary abilities. Misstatement of the facts and making things up in true crime or other nonfiction is bad writing and does very clearly reflect the writer's literary abilities, and even more importantly, it reflects the true degree of their integrity and professionalism, or more accurately, their lack thereof. The Darren O'Neill case, the subject of a book of mine called To Die For, serves as a good example. It's a disturbing case. It is sometimes violent and occasionally contains gruesome details. I do not and will not apologize for including the gruesome and explicit details in the book, or any of my other books. I'm simply attempting to show the reader the manner in which the crimes were committed, not trying to be the Margaret Mitchell of true crime. I don't show the reader 8 pages of description of a city street with trees lining both sides of it and describe each and every individual tree, and I don't talk too much about the magnolias in bloom, although a little of that's okay. Instead, I simply try to show the reader how the crimes are committed, put the reader into the crime victim and the crime victim's family's shoes, and let them see things through their eyes whenever possible. With the Darren O'Neill case, I attempted to depict Darren O'Neill for the cowardly, sociopathic monster that he really is. If this bars that book or any of my others from critical acclaim or making it onto television, then so be it. At the very least, I'll be able to maintain my integrity as a writer. I'll know what I've done. Sociopathic killers such as Darren O'Neill should never be glorified, even minimally, as such killers often are. For that reason, I spared no details in 2 of my previous books, Bloodlust, Portrait of a Serial Sex Killer, which is about serial killer Dayton Leroy Rogers, Oregon's worst serial killer to date, and Driven to Kill, the story of serial child killer Wesley Allen Dodd. To elevate the status of such anomalies of society, even unintentionally, by showing them inaccurately, by embellishing and embroidering, as Jack Olson would say, their characters or any part of their story, gives the appearance of lessening the degree or severity of their actions to the reader, and it's absolutely wrong in every sense of the word. To do so simply because the writer wants his or book to become a movie of the week is, I believe, selfish and immoral. A writer who will stoop to such tactics has not considered the feelings of a victim's family at all. Because I have been led in the past to believe, not by my readers, but by other writers, that the way in which I was writing my books was injurious and wrong, that is, including explicit descriptions, I once asked the mother of murder victim Robin Smith, whose case is thoroughly outlined in To Die For, how far she wanted me to go with the unpleasant details. Without hesitating, even for an instant, Edna Smith responded, and I quote, "Tell everything, just like it happened. Spare no details on my account. I want the world to know what Darren O'Neill did to my daughter and to my family." End quote. I subsequently asked others, including readers at book sightings and at writers' conferences, a similar question, and not surprisingly to me, received similar responses. While I have the utmost respect and sympathy for any victim's family, omitting the gruesome details, the truth as to what actually happened, in other words, would only serve to do a victim's family yet another injury by making the killer, in the case that I've been quoting, Darren O'Neill, seem less the monster than he really is. I simply believe in telling it like it is, and I will continue to do so for as long as I continue to be a writer. Finally, in closing, I'd just like to say that true crime books are, quite simply, works of nonfiction and are in many ways historical in nature. Although filled with tragedy, they become a somewhat permanent record of the events of a given case. And even though historical events are subject to a certain amount of interpretation by the writer, there is no excuse for a true crime writer to make things up and deliberately omit significant details. If such a writer wants to make things up and or move into the literary mainstream, he or she should stay out of the true crime genre and simply write fiction. We all, of course, want to make money from our books and desire them to be commercially successful, and I would be a liar if I attempted to portray myself as an exception. That is, after all, one of the primary reasons why we write, whether we write fiction or nonfiction. Most of us, I believe, love words, love putting words together, love telling the stories, and we just simply love to write. But it is a vocation. It is the way we make our livings. We discover at some point what we are capable of doing, then carve out our niche and stick with it. Personally, however, I find it preferable to gauge my own degree of success, not by the number of books I sell or whether my work becomes a movie of the week, but instead by whether I have been accurate and honest to myself and my readers, not only through the integrity of the story, but in honor of the memory and out of respect for the victims and their families that I'm writing about. If I have accomplished that not-so-easy task, then I will have found the success I've been looking for. And that's it for this podcast. I want to thank everyone for listening. Be sure and join me on my website, truecrimeking.com, where you can listen to other podcasts, find out about my other books. You can also sign up for my mailing list there. Also join me on Facebook, facebook.com/truecrimeking, and on Twitter. We'll have another podcast coming up soon. Again, thank you for joining me. Stay tuned.